He was only 10 years old when he spoke the words that froze the room. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he described the mud of the trenches, the stench of rotting flesh, and the sound of shells exploding overhead. He said he remembered the fear of waiting in the dark, the weight of a rifle in his hands, the moment his body fell when the bullets came. His parents stared at him in silence, their child speaking with the voice of a man long dead. What he described belonged to a century past, a war no living soldier of that conflict still remained to tell. Yet the details were precise, sharp, impossible to dismiss. The boy insisted he had lived before. He said he had been a soldier in the Great War. His words carried no hesitation, no sense of invention, only the flat certainty of memory. He described uniforms he had never seen, places he had never visited, phrases of military slang that had not been spoken in decades. To the family, it began as unease, but unease gave way to dread as his memories grew darker. He spoke of names he should not know, of villages he had never visited, of wounds that still ached in a body too young to carry them. It is easy to dismiss the imagination of a child, but his words carried a weight that imagination alone could not explain. He did not tell stories with the wide-eyed wonder of invention. He spoke them like a confession, each memory dragging him deeper into something he could not escape. His parents asked him where he had heard such things, and he only shook his head. He said it was not something he had learned. It was something he had lived. How does a child speak of a war he never studied? How does he describe the mud, the screams, the taste of blood in the air, with the accuracy of someone who had stood among the dying? And how does he know details that historians themselves had buried in archives? Was it the imagination of a boy, the echoes of forgotten stories absorbed without notice, or something far more disturbing, the voice of the past, returned through the body of the living? The family hoped it was only a phase, that his words would fade with time. But they did not fade. They sharpened. And soon, what he remembered would reach beyond the walls of his home, drawing the attention of scholars, skeptics, and believers alike. What began as a child's strange words would become a case that shook even historians, forcing them to confront a question no one wishes to answer. If the dead can speak again, through the mouths of the living, how much of the past have we truly buried? The boy was born into an ordinary home, the kind of place where the past was spoken of only in fragments, if at all. His parents lived quiet lives, working, saving, raising their children in a town that had forgotten the weight of the wars that once devoured the world. Photographs of ancestors hung on the walls, but their faces were little more than fading portraits in dust-covered frames. The First World War was not discussed, not in classrooms, not in family stories. For the boy, there should have been no way to know it, no way to breathe its shadows into words. And yet, from the moment he first spoke of it, his life and theirs was consumed. He was 10, and until then his childhood had been unremarkable. He liked the same games as other children, laughed at the same stories, ran in the same streets. But then the dreams began. His parents would hear him cry out at night, calling names they did not recognize, pleading with voices no child should know. They found him soaked in sweat, trembling, whispering about shells, trenches, and comrades who would not rise again. At first, they told themselves it was nothing more than nightmares. But nightmares fade. His did not dot in the daylight. He spoke of his dreams as if they were not dreams at all. He told his parents about mud that pulled at his boots, about rats that swarmed over the fallen, about men who sang songs to drown out the sound of artillery. He said he remembered the taste of iron in his mouth when shrapnel tore the air. He drew pictures of rifles, helmets, trenches lined with barbed wire. They were not the clumsy doodles of a child inventing monsters. They were diagrams, precise, detailed in ways his teachers could not explain. The family did not know what to do. They were not superstitious people, not inclined to speak of spirits or past lives. But they knew their son had never seen these things. He had never read books about the Great War, never watched films that described its horrors. Their town library held little more than simple accounts, and the boy's words reached far beyond them. He spoke with a familiarity that came not from study, but from memory. At first, they kept his stories within the family, fearing ridicule if they spoke of them. But secrecy is fragile. One afternoon in school, when the teacher asked the class to write about their summer, he wrote about a battlefield. He described in grim detail a place called the Somme, a name that had not been spoken in that classroom before. His classmates stared, his teacher turned pale, and by evening his words had reached the ears of others. Soon, neighbors were whispering, the town began to wonder, and the family found themselves under a gaze they had not asked for. The boy himself seemed caught between two worlds. He laughed like any child, but his laughter was brief, fragile, as if shadowed by something that waited beneath. He would fall silent suddenly, his eyes distant, and then he would speak as though pulled into another time. His parents began to fear those moments, when he was both their son and someone they did not know. They wondered what it meant for his future, wondered what kind of life could grow from a past that refused to release him. What unsettled them most was not his words, but the certainty in them. He did not ask if it might be true. He insisted it was. He spoke of war not as history, but as memory, and no amount of denial could silence him. It was not something he had read, not something he had heard. It was something he carried, something he believed he had lived. And so, in the year of his 10th birthday, the quiet family that had once been like any other found themselves standing at the edge of a mystery they could neither accept nor dismiss. They did not know then that his memories would reach beyond their home, beyond their town, until even historians were forced to listen. What had begun as the strange dreams of a boy was about to become a story that would disturb the living and trouble the dead. The first signs of something beyond imagination came not in his words, but in his drawings. Sheets of paper filled with sketches of trenches, each one lined with wire, mud heaped into mounds, crude ladders drawn leading up into what he called no man's land. He drew rifles in careful detail, weapons he should not have known existed, some labeled in a shaky hand with names that startled his teachers. One picture showed a helmet with a crack down the center, the kind worn by British soldiers, shaded with obsessive care. When asked how he knew what it looked like, he only shrugged. He said he remembered at night, the dreams sharpened into visions that frightened even him. He woke screaming about shells whistling through the air, about bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in mud, so deep it pulled men down like quicksand. He whispered the names of places that were unfamiliar to his parents, but chillingly familiar to anyone who had read accounts of the war. Verdun, Ypres, Somme. His parents had never spoken of them. He had never read them. And yet, he spoke with a fluency that could not be ignored. The family tried to shield him, to explain it away as coincidence or an unusually vivid imagination. But then came the slip of the tongue that made denial impossible. One morning, when his father was dressing for work, the boy stared at him and muttered, "We were told to polish our boots before inspection." His father froze. The boy had never been in the military, never spoken with anyone who had served, and yet his tone was one of recollection, not invention. Soon, others began to notice. His classmates reported that he sometimes sat silent for long stretches, his eyes unfocused, before suddenly describing the smell of gas, the burn in his lungs, the cries of men clawing at their throats. His teacher began keeping notes, convinced this was more than a child's fantasy. She recorded his words, line by line, and when she compared them to historical documents, she found details that matched accounts written by soldiers themselves. The first undeniable proof emerged during a family outing to a local museum. The boy paused before a case of medals and pointed to one with trembling fingers. He whispered the name of a soldier long dead, a name engraved in the archive but never displayed. He said he remembered wearing it, remembered the day it was pinned to his chest before the march that would end in his death. His parents stood in silence, unable to breathe. The museum curator later confirmed the name. Buried in records few living eyes had seen after that day, whispers spread beyond the town. Historians who dismissed stories of reincarnation as superstition found themselves staring at the boy's words with unease. Journalists arrived, notebooks in hand, recording his statements with skeptical smiles that faded when he answered questions too precise for guessing. He described how the trenches smelled in winter, how men carved messages into the stocks of their rifles, how the mud turned black when mixed with blood. These were not facts a 10-year-old child could stumble upon. They were lived experiences, spoken with a weight that silenced even the most hardened skeptic. The boy himself seemed both frightened and relieved when he spoke. He admitted he could not stop the memories. They came in waves, uninvited, carrying him back into a world he should never have known. He said he did not want them, but he could not escape them. The more he remembered, the more his laughter faded, until he seemed older than his years, a child's face carrying the eyes of a man who had already seen too much. His parents no longer asked if he was imagining. The question had become meaningless. They now wondered something far more disturbing. Whose memories were they raising in the body of their son? When the boy's claims reached beyond his town, curiosity gave way to investigation. Scholars, journalists, and skeptics traveled to hear him speak, each convinced they would uncover the trick. Yet the longer they listened, the less certain they became. He did not stumble over details, nor did he speak as if repeating something he had been taught. His words carried the cadence of memory. He described not just the events of war, but the sensations that filled its silence, the wet wool of uniforms soaked through with rain, the gnawing ache of hunger in the belly, the way men whispered to themselves before going over the top, as if the act of speaking aloud could hold them together for one more minute. First layer of proof came from his descriptions of weapons. Asked by a researcher to draw the rifle he claimed to have carried, the boy sketched with unsettling precision the outline of a Lee Enfield rifle, a weapon he should never have seen. He even added the small markings soldiers once carved into the stock scratches. Initials, crude attempts at ownership in a world where everything was stripped away. A historian who reviewed the drawing admitted it was disturbingly accurate. A boy had no access to such material. In his school library, no such illustrations existed. In his home, there were no books, no films, no relics of war. And yet the rifle appeared on his paper as though drawn from long memory. Second piece of evidence came in his recollections of places. He named villages in France, obscure hamlets that had been reduced to rubble by artillery fire. He described a church bell tower struck by shell fire, its roof collapsing in flames. When investigators compared his words to military records, they found accounts of a small village destroyed in exactly the way he described. The boy had never left his country, never seen photographs of those ruins. Still, he spoke of them as if he had walked through their ashes. Psychologists pressed him, testing for fabrication. They asked trick questions, leading him toward errors. But he corrected them. When shown photographs of modern trenches reconstructed for exhibitions, he shook his head. He said the walls were wrong, too clean, too neat. Real trenches, he insisted, collapsed under rain, their walls slick with mud that smelled like rot. He told them soldiers carved niches into the dirt to hold candles, their wax dripping onto the muck below. His correction startled the examiners, because such details appeared in diaries buried deep in archives, unseen by the public. Still, contradictions emerged. Some of his recollections were too vague, too sweeping to be tested. At times he seemed to speak in fragments, as if reliving flashes of trauma rather than recounting full memories. Skeptics seized upon this, arguing that he was merely absorbing scattered facts from overheard conversations or glimpses of television. Yet those who spoke with him for long hours came away uneasy. He was not reciting knowledge. He was reliving something. His pauses, his silences, his sudden stares into nothingness carried more weight than his words. It was as though the memories were not being told but forced out, unbidden, from a place he could not control. Artifacts were brought to him: helmets, canteens, rusted shell casings. He touched them carefully, as though greeting old companions. Once, when handed a battered metal identification tag, he closed his eyes and whispered a name. Investigators later found the name belonged to a soldier listed as killed in action, a man whose body had never been recovered. The boy had no way of knowing him. Yet he spoke the name as though speaking of himself. The debate grew more desperate. Was this proof of reincarnation, the echo of a life lived and lost in the mud of Europe? Or was it something else entirely, a possession, a haunting, a mind somehow pierced by the grief of the dead? Psychologists argued over subconscious memory. Theorists debated the possibility of genetic imprinting, while believers spoke of souls that refused to rest. Each theory clashed against the other, none offering closure. The deeper the investigations went, the more the mystery thickened. No one could explain how a 10-year-old boy, with no access to archives, no exposure to war films, no knowledge of history, could recall the texture of trench walls, the color of flares in the night sky, the names of men who had died decades before his birth. His case meant to be unraveled, only tangled further, the more it was studied. And so his story passed from the hands of psychologists to historians, from historians to skeptics, and from skeptics back to the frightened parents who could no longer deny that something beyond comprehension had taken root in their son. The boy himself grew pale, his laughter dimming with each passing day, as if the act of remembering was training him. He did not speak of wanting to prove anything. He only said he wanted it to stop. But the memories did not stop. They only sharpened, as though the past itself was demanding to be heard through him. The weight of the memories did not rest on the boy alone. They spread like cracks through his home, his family bending under the strain of something they could neither explain nor control. His parents, once ordinary people, found themselves unable to recognize the child they had raised. They watched him speak with the vocabulary of a man long dead, describing battles and weapons with a certainty that made them feel like strangers in their own house. Their nights became sleepless, filled with dread of the next outburst, the next fragment of history that slipped from their son's mouth. Their child was slipping away, not into adolescence, but into another life altogether. The boy himself grew restless. Where once he had played, now he lingered in silence, his eyes clouded as though he were watching scenes invisible to others. He told his mother that sometimes the smell of smoke filled his room, even when no fire burned. He told his father that he woke with aching in his chest, certain he had been shot again. He began to draw less for amusement and more as compulsion, covering page after page with sketches of trenches, soldiers, and weapons, as if he could not rest until the memories were placed onto paper. His hands trembled as he worked, and sometimes tears stained the lines he drew. The community, too, began to shift uneasily under the burden of his story. Neighbors spoke of him in hushed voices. Some avoided the family altogether, fearful of what they called the curse of remembrance. Others sought him out, hoping to hear from the mouth of a child details they believed came from beyond the grave. Each encounter left the family more isolated. The boy's classmates looked at him differently. He was no longer a friend, no longer a peer. He was something uncanny, too young to be feared openly, but too strange to be embraced. Historians who listened to him often left shaken. One described how the boy, after speaking calmly of a long-forgotten skirmish, suddenly wept and said he still heard the cries of men calling for their mothers. Another recalled him speaking in sudden bursts of military slang, the kind preserved only in rare documents. They had expected to expose him, to unmask a fraud, but instead they walked away unsettled, questioning their own understanding of memory, of death, of what lingers after both. The family fractured beneath the attention. His father withdrew into silence, refusing to entertain further questions from outsiders. His mother began to pray in secret, convinced her son was trapped by something that could not be explained by science alone. The boy himself grew thinner, his laughter reduced to rare, fragile moments quickly extinguished by the shadow of recollection. Sometimes he would wake in the night and beg to be freed, his small hands clutching at his chest as though the wound of another man still lived inside him. The trauma extended beyond those walls. Teachers confessed they no longer knew how to treat him. Some avoided calling on him in class, fearful of what might emerge if they asked him to speak. Others studied him too closely, their curiosity thinly disguised, their questions designed to coax out more horrors. Even those who believed none of it found themselves disturbed, unable to dismiss the way his words clung to them after leaving the room. It was not only the family that suffered, but the very fabric of the community. His story spread, and with it came unease, as though he were not merely a child, but a reminder of something no one wanted to remember. The war had ended generations earlier, but through him it returned, dragging with it the mud, the screams, the ghosts of men who had died with eyes open to a sky they would never see again. The boy had become a vessel, unwilling, fragile, and breaking beneath the weight of memory. And those around him could no longer tell whether they were watching a child haunted by a story or a soldier, forced to live again through the body of a boy. The case soon drew the attention of minds trained to dismantle mystery. Psychologists, historians, theologians, even skeptics with no patience for superstition, arrived to measure the boy's words against their disciplines. Each sought to frame his story within their understanding of the world. Yet every explanation, no matter how rational or compelling, unraveled under its own weight. What remained was not clarity, but a widening void, one that swallowed certainty with every attempt to explain it. The first theory to gain traction was reincarnation. For many, it was the simplest conclusion. The boy was not inventing stories, nor was he possessed. He was remembering. His body was new, but his soul, they claimed, had lived before. His knowledge of battlefields, the names of soldiers, the details of weapons were proof that a life extinguished in the mud of World War I had found its way back into flesh. Spiritualists held him up as evidence, a living testament to the return of the dead. They argued that memory cannot be buried with the body, that the soul carries it forward into another life. The boy, in their eyes, was not extraordinary, but inevitable, a reminder that no death is final. Yet skeptics countered with psychology. They claimed his words were not memories, but constructions, drawn from fragments of information absorbed unconsciously. Perhaps he had overheard stray conversations, glimpsed images he could not consciously recall, pieced together knowledge without realizing. Children, they argued, are sponges, capable of retaining far more than adults suspect. His nightmares, his drawings, his stories were nothing more than the flowering of an overactive mind, tangled with fragments he had unknowingly collected. They insisted there was no mystery, only the ordinary power of memory misdirected. But their arguments faltered against the details he gave, the obscure references even experts had to confirm in dusty archives. A third, more unsettling theory emerged in whispers. It was not reincarnation, nor subconscious knowledge, but something darker. The boy was not remembering his own past. He was carrying the unfinished story of another. Some called it possession, others a haunting of the mind rather than the body. Perhaps, they suggested, The grief of a soldier who died nameless and forgotten had clung to the world, seeking a voice through the first vessel it could find. In this view, the boy was not a soul reborn but a host, a child consumed by echoes of a man whose death had been too violent to rest. It was a theory few dared to speak aloud, for it implied that the boundary between the living and the dead is thin, fragile, and easily crossed. The investigations grew more desperate as the contradictions deepened. A historian interviewed him with maps of Europe laid across the table. The boy traced his finger along a route, describing the march of his regiment, his words aligning with records nearly forgotten. Another test had him describe military slang, obscure phrases preserved only in diaries. He spoke them fluently, as if they had never left his tongue. Each time experts tried to trap him, to prove fabrication, he slipped past their nets, not by cleverness, but by the raw weight of his knowledge. And yet there were gaps. Sometimes he faltered, forgetting what he had once spoken with clarity. Sometimes his memories blurred, as if fading, leaving him shaken and confused. This fueled another theory, that he was both remembering and forgetting at once, caught in the process of losing a life, not his own. One psychologist remarked that watching him was like watching a candle flicker, the flame of memory refusing to die but unable to burn steady. None of the theories brought peace. Each one carried its own terror. If reincarnation was true, then death is never the end, and memory is a prison carried from one life to the next. If psychology was correct, then the mind is a labyrinth so vast it can create truths out of fragments, trapping the innocent in illusions too heavy to escape. And if possession was real, then the dead do not rest at all, they linger, they cling, and they find ways to return through those too young to resist. The boy remained the center of it all, his small body weighed down by questions larger than life itself. He did not care for theories. He did not ask for explanations. He only asked for the memories to stop, for the shadows to leave him. But they did not. They pressed on, relentless, until even those who studied him began to doubt their own beliefs. Some investigators confessed privately that they left more disturbed than when they arrived, as if the boy had infected them with the same unease that haunted his family. In the end, the investigations yielded no answer, only fragments of possibility. Each theory was a mirror, reflecting fear back at those who gazed into it. And when the experts departed, the boy was left as he had been before, small, pale, trembling beneath the weight of a life he had never lived, and perhaps another he could never escape. The story of the boy lingers not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. He did not speak like a child imagining adventure. He spoke like someone confessing a burden. His words carried no excitement, no pride, only the heavy flatness of memory endured. Those who listened felt it immediately, the sense that they were not hearing invention, but recollection. And that weight is what continues to trouble all who have studied his case. Years have passed since his first words, yet no one has been able to bury the questions he raised. His family never returned to normal. His parents, once eager to see their son grow into the future, found themselves watching him with unease, fearing he might forever be trapped in a war that ended long before he was born. Teachers avoided speaking of him. Neighbors crossed the street. Some pitied him, others feared him, but none could look at him without remembering the way he spoke of trenches and death, as if he had been there. Historians who encountered him remain unsettled even in their silence. Some quietly admit that his testimony contained details no child could have fabricated. Others insist there must be an explanation, yet undiscovered. But the truth is that their own certainty cracked when faced with him. They came to disprove him, yet left with doubts they never expected to carry. It is not only the boy who was haunted. It was everyone who heard him. What makes his story unbearable is its ordinariness. He was not chosen, not extraordinary, not born into strange rituals or mysticism. He was a boy, like countless others, until the memories surfaced. If such a thing could happen to him, could it not happen to any child? Could memories of violence, of fear, of death itself, be waiting in all of us, dormant, until something awakens them? That possibility is what no one wishes to consider, yet it is what his life demands we face. The question remains, what was he? Was he the rebirth of a soldier, carrying the remnants of a life cut short? Was he the victim of a mind too porous, absorbing fragments of history with unnatural precision? Or was he something far more terrifying, a vessel for the dead who refused to rest, their grief spilling forward into the bodies of the living? None of the theories satisfy, and perhaps that is why his story will never die. It resists conclusion, because conclusion would mean peace. And peace has never been part of it. Even now, those who revisit his case find themselves unsettled. The boy grew older, but the memories remained. They faded at times, only to return in flashes, leading him shaking, whispering of the war, as if it had ended only yesterday. He lived in two times at once, and those who knew him could never decide which life was truly his. His story endures not as history, but as warning that the past does not stay buried. It waits, patient, ready to rise again in voices unprepared to carry it. And so the haunting question remains unanswered. If a child can awaken with the memories of the dead, how many of us carry fragments we cannot yet hear? How many of us are only one dream away from remembering lives we never lived, deaths we never died? The answer does not come. The silence is heavier than words. If this story unsettled you, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. More forgotten histories and mysteries await, stories the world tried to bury, but that still breathe in the shadows.